it's fun to be a part of that planning and helping the client come, when they sit back and say, can I afford to do this?
Yeah.
What does this look like? And, one of the Welcome to the Live Greater View, a financial planning podcast produced by VLP Financial Advisors that discusses life, money, and perspective. We help clients live their best life at every stage through our VLP Live Greater partnership process. Thank you for tuning in. All right, welcome back, Chris. So episode 38 of the podcast, interesting topic we have here today, really about micro retirements and kind of how its work is changing for the younger generation.
Yeah, a lot of things to think through here, just how retirement in general has changed. A lot of this is a fall-on effect from the pandemic, remote work. A lot of this is really going to be baked into our conversation today.
Yeah, it's definitely a trend that's picking up. So it's something that we're starting to see a little bit more of, and kind of how that might change, the future landscape of retirement.
We'll see. Well, I think it's best if we start by just defining what micro retirement is. And then obviously we'll get to different thoughts and what we've seen from practice.
Yeah. So what we're really seeing here is an intentional break. We're having a generation decide that they're going to take a break from work for whatever reason that may be. A lot of times this is going to be travel. Maybe it's a shift if they're working at a high-paced job and they want to maybe explore another option, but really take an intentional shift and departure from work for maybe a year or so, an extended period of time, which really allows them to kind of figure out, maybe they want to do some traveling and really think about, they're probably they think this generation is saying, hey, we're going to work longer. The retirement age is going to continue to go up. And we want to be able to do the things when we're younger, more able, and maybe really planning about how to have the funds to do those things.
And the chart, so to say, that sticks out to me is if you think in the past of what a traditional career trajectory would look like, it was very stable, up and to the right. Hey, you work forever, you save more money, and this is the path. Now it's much more intermittent, where you work hard for X amount of years, you take these breaks, you shift careers, you have different, sort of ways of making money. And I think that's here to stay. And also, if we think typically in the past where we've had pension plans or, that sort of aspect where it's a very rigid structure of, hey, you work for 30 years, you collect this much in retirement.
Yep.
Now we've seen the advent of obviously 401k plans. Hey, you save and you have a lot more flexibility for what your retirement actually looks like to you.
Yeah. And really it's to your point with the pensions, it was time in, right? It was time in at your desk. Your feet, you're hitting the ground and you're running hard for those consecutive years, where this is really, again, that shift where you might be in a position where you save a lot of money younger, you let that compounding work for you, but you also take those intentional breaks to kind of do the things that most people would do, generations would have done at retirement if they make it.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's dive into really what we've seen as a theme when it comes to some of these micro retirements working with clients.
Yeah. So it's a couple, one that really strike out is a lot of doing travel, right? They decided, I want to go learn yoga in Bali, or I'm going to take off time and I'm going to hike the Appalachian Trail, or go overseas. So we're really starting to see a lot of that's around intentional travel and trips where they want to do these things while they're younger and healthier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would say too, also when you have two, type A, people that are earning a lot of money and all of a sudden they know kids are coming into the picture.
Yep.
They say, hey, let's do those trips. And, I'd rather spend time in Europe before I'm, hanging out at Chick-fil-A,
you can't take your
on the
kids
weekends. Yeah. So that kind of thing. And, also there's obviously that younger demographic, particularly within tech and consulting, that has gone down this path. I would say too, if we flip to the Gen Z side, we've also seen a lot of this where, let's say they're, mid to late 50s, they're not quite ready to retire. They know that they have a couple more innings left in something, but then they know I want to have a structured break before I go into that final push before I ultimately retire.
Yeah. And to your point, that we see a lot more and more of, and really it is, they have been doing that grind for 20, 30 years. And now they say, hey, I've saved all this money. I've done all this intentional work. Maybe now my kids are off to college and I don't have to work as hard. I don't have as many requirements on income and earning. And I want to take that break and maybe I want to do something different.
Yeah.
That's a big shift we see in that Gen Z generation.
Yeah. And that's really from that more so planned approach. We've also seen this really come to fruition organically, where somebody gets laid off and then next thing you know, hey, you know what? Like I wasn't expecting this. I didn't have this, in my cards, but it's here. and now I'm going to
They
take
were
this as an
doged.
opportunity.
Yeah.
Something along those lines.
Or
Yeah.
COVID.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think COVID has really brought this to the forefront where a lot of people, that was an interesting time, certainly in our generation, that we haven't seen before, right? Where we actually had a shutdown where things were closed and people weren't out socializing. And I think a lot of people stepped back and said, is this, this remote work was great. Maybe it wasn't great. It was too isolating. Maybe there are things I want to do, or maybe, and it also gave them an opportunity to say, hey, maybe there's something else I want to do. And, maybe there's something artistic I want to lean into, or just a complete different mindset change.
Mm-hmm. And through your experience, I know we painted travel with a broader brush. What types of stories can you share of clients that have gone down this path that you've worked with?
Yeah. And some of it, I've had one specific client who actually, it was all about volunteering. So we spent a lot of time going to countries with the Red Cross, Hands and Hearts, and where they're going and rebuilding areas that have been impacted. So for some, it was very charitable philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to spend time giving back.
Mm-hmm.
They had a great career in IT and with some of the technology firms, so they had these assets, but they really wanted to do something meaningful and a little bit different. Not that I guess maybe IT is meaningful, but in their instance, it was an opportunity to kind of explore that side of their charitable and go see parts of the world they would have never seen otherwise. Mm-hmm. Others, it's been the backpacking. It's going over and spending, a significant amount of time off the grid, or, just overseas exploring areas that they haven't had an opportunity to spend a significant amount of time. When you're going to fly to Australia or New Zealand,
Right.
you don't want to spend, 5 days there.
Right. For me, I would say that I really have two that come to mind. One, fits more the younger mold, and then the latter is Gen Z. The first one is a couple who, essentially worked in tech, and they both just had run so hard for, let's call it 10 plus years. And together they said, we're going to shift our focus from working in California to this area to be more by family. And they intentionally took 3 months and lived in France. And then obviously after the summer, then they re-entered the workforce, and, we helped them plot all of that out and help them think through that. And then on the other side of the spectrum with Gen X, we worked with a client who was unfortunately laid off. And next thing you know, here comes the spring and then summer. They really spent, 3 to 4 months really trying to up their golf game, just something that they loved at one point in time, hadn't been able to do over the years, and then really wanted to get back into for that sort of next phase before they went back to work, and then went on from there. They did a golf camp in Pinehurst for 5 days, and it just sounded, amazing. So very cool, to share those stories.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's fun to be a part of that planning and helping the client come, when they sit back and say, can I afford to do this?
Yeah.
What does this look like? And, one of the main takeaways in conversations we have with clients, it's better to plan ahead. And that's what we talk about, those rainy day funds. What if work becomes too much, or you get laid off? How do we prepare that if there's an extended period of time where you don't have income by choice, or by not by choice, that we can, you have options, right? And that's really where the planning comes in, to say, hey, I want to do this in Pinehurst. I want to go to Europe for 3 months and do, hike and do these things. There's going to be a cost to that. So really kind of having that forethought and putting that into the scenario really kind of allows them to have the freedom. If that does arise, it takes the worry out of it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's great. I'm glad that we shared those specifics. Let's talk about why, from a 30,000 foot view, we think this is happening. Mm-hmm. This sort of theme of what does retirement look like to you? No right or wrong answers. I feel like that's become more and more prevalent over the last handful of years. So let's spend some time talking about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is shifting. There's a lot of uncertainty. First of all, let's back up with, life expectancy has significantly increased over the last several decades, right? It used to be my parents' generation, they thought they would retire at 65. Maybe they live 5-7 years in retirement, but the reality is they're living 20 to 30. So, a lot of people are working longer, some by choice, some not by choice, but some, we have this conversation all the time. Like when we say, when you're going to retire, what are you going to do? And what are you going to retire to? Yeah. So I think a lot of the reality is, hey, I'm going to be working longer because we're living longer. What is Social Security going to look like? When am I going to be able to collect those types of things? So I think for a lot of those people is kind of find that work-life balance. and being able to take time off and spend time with their family in France, if that's, or their significant other, or whatever that looks like. Chasing some artistic scenario where they want to be, they want to try something new or take a little bit of break and maybe kind of a reset. So I think that's been kind of one of the drivers we've seen, certainly with the age. And they want to have more experiences now. I think it's definitely shift from, past generations. If you look at the boomers and maybe Gen X, I guess I am Gen X. We want to spend more time that they're taking intentional resets, right? We're taking some time to say, hey, whether now maybe it's just a couple of weeks here and there, but some are really thinking about it and pulling out that trigger and taking off that time for months.
Yeah. And when we also think about that from a millennials perspective, it's interesting because this is now them seeing their parents' generation retiring. And in some instances, all of that stuff goes well where they have the money, have their health, and they're able to do all those things in retirement. And then in other situations, the reality is they don't have all of those things. So it's not as they drew it up. And they say, hey, I need to make sure that I check off some of these things on my bucket list, have my family focus more on experiences versus all of these sort of materialistic things down the road.
And that's a great point. In some cases, it's, the millennial child, their boomer parents are retired or that generation, and they're going to spend the 2 months overseas or traveling, and they're going, well, I want to go, and, as Bruce always says, if you pay, they will come. So there's some of that too, where, it's part of, they want to participate in some of the family longer trips that are potentially could be happening. And I think what's really interesting is, according to a survey by IRS Software Group, 13% of current retirees plan to re-enter the workforce in 2025, due to financial pressure. So kind of to your point, there are people who are retiring and realizing, hey, I don't have the means to do the things I want to do. And as a result, we're kind of seeing that, younger workers are saying, hey, my reality is it's not going to be retiring at 60 or 65 and 70. And, getting this time to take that off intentionally and do some of those things are making sense.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we talked about really what it is, what we've seen from our experiences. Let's talk about some of the conversation pieces that we have with clients who approach us about potentially going down this path and things that we think are important to address before they cross this bridge. Yeah.
Well, you really got to plan. What does, how are you going to pay for things, right? That's like number one. That's like the easy fruit. Picking that one is, how much are you going to have in savings? What if you are going to travel, or if you're going to, in some instances, some take a reset and go back to school to learn a different trade, or, I had one who went back to art school for a year. So when you do that is, how are we going to pay for that? What does that look like? How much do we think we need to anticipate for funds? And we always put a little extra in there because, life just comes at you. You're just not going to be able to anticipate that. I think the biggest thing that you have to plan for if you're taking that break from work is health insurance. Because if you are not 65, obviously you're not going to be eligible for Medicare. Then you have to go out into the ACA, which, the one beautiful bill is going to change that structure come January. So there's going to be some conversations we have to have with some clients around that. But, if you have COBRA, do you take COBRA? Do you go onto the marketplace? What does that look like? And that's going to be a large chunk of the expense. So that's one of the other things we have to talk about. Maybe you can talk a little about, retirement accounts and how that looks.
Yeah, the account piece is one that we absolutely will spend time mapping out. So there's really two pieces to that. One is within this break, you want to make sure that you have money set aside outside of your retirement accounts and outside of, I would say, just sort of a rainy day fund. There needs to be, in our opinion, some separate siloed taxable investment account.
Yep.
Then obviously the investments would vary for this purpose. And then on the retirement account side, you really want to make sure that those investments will continue to compound for you during this sort of break. And then also that you're, in most cases, front loading those savings. So there's a give and a take to this. If I'm going to take X amount of, months or a year off, you, in a perfect world, would pull forward any sort of savings that you'd have during those years.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then also, we also talk a little about structure. You might want to be a little bit more aggressive because if you're not putting in when you're not engaged or working in this time period and setting funds aside, we need to consider how we're going to make up for that lost time.
Right. And the last piece, as far as things that we really check the boxes on, is a reentry plan.
Yep.
And I think that this is so interesting because it really weaves in the psychological side of things plus the money aspect.
It could be challenging. Yeah, because if if it goes great, then there's the whole, do I have to go back to work? Well, yeah. Or, what is that going to look like? Or I really don't miss what I did. And in some cases they do miss what they did. But, if you've been out of the workforce for a significant amount of time, we've had clients who've taken a year off, how do your skills translate? If you're in a field where things change rapidly, did you miss something? Do you have to keep up? What are, there are going to be trainings you're going to need to take, those types of things. If you are making a career change, what does that look like? And that really can be a challenge, because if you're making a career change, you can't expect to come at the same level you were prior.
Right. And I also think, in addition to those things, maintaining your network, as far as, hey, I'm not working, but I'm still staying in contact with people that it would make sense to stay in contact with for that eventual return, to work, is just something that's really important. You want to take a break, but you don't want to go completely off the grid in a lot of situations. So I just wanted to mention that too. Well, anything else, on that? I think we really ran the gambit there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack here. I think this is something we're seeing trending more often, certainly with the millennial generation, and certainly in the tech area. It's been something where we see a lot. Someone works for a tech firm, gets some RSUs, company goes public, and that's a lot of work, and they just need a mental break and reset. I do think that it's interesting, and I think with the right planning and looking at all these aspects and kind of button them up, you really can have a successful micro retirement, and then and not set yourself back for the future.
Great. Well, Rose, thank you as always. We went through a lot there, and we'd like to wrap up and thank our listeners. We're over 1,000 subscribers on
Pretty
YouTube.
Exciting. Yeah.
We're making a lot of headway. This topic, as well as a lot of our other topics, really come through organic conversations and themes that we see pop up often with clients. So I would just encourage our listeners, if there's something like this that you'd like to hear our thoughts on air, please let us know. And thank you as always for listening.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Live Great Review. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Spotify, and recommend our podcast to family and friends. To learn more about VLP Financial Advisors, please check out our website at vlpfa.com. Thanks again.
And now for our necessary disclosures. Securities and advisor services offered through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA SIPC, a broker-dealer and registered investment advisor. All investing involves risk, including the possible loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will be successful. The views stated in this podcast are not necessarily the opinion of Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, and should not be construed directly or indirectly as an offer to buy or sell any securities mentioned. Due to the volatility with the markets mentioned, opinions are subject to change without notice. Information is based on sources believed to be reliable. However, their accuracy or completeness cannot be guaranteed. Past performance does not guarantee future results.